It's 1944. The American advance across the Pacific is a relentless, island-hopping tidal wave. On a speck of land like Saipan, the fighting is savage, brutal, and without quarter. But amid the fire and blood, a remarkable event unfolds. As U.S. Marines and soldiers capture thousands of Japanese civilians and soldiers, they encounter a group that defies every wartime expectation. These are not the fanatic, screaming soldiers of propaganda. These are women, nurses, and auxiliary personnel, their faces etched with the terror of a collapsing empire. They've been fed a steady diet of propaganda that painted American GIs as barbaric monsters, capable of the most depraved acts. They were told surrender meant torture, rape, and a horrific death. Many of their comrades chose suicide rather than face this fate. Yet, as they are led into the American camps, they brace for the worst. Instead of brutality, they find order, sanitation, and even compassion, a stark, bewildering contrast to the life they just escaped. What they experience next would not just change their minds about the enemy, it would challenge the very foundation of Japanese military ideology, turning a place of captivity into an almost unimaginable haven. This is the story of how American POW camps became, for a group of Japanese women, a version of paradise. The air on Saipan in the summer of 1944 was thick with the scent of death and the humid stench of jungle rot. The Battle of Saipan had been a meat grinder, a relentless 24-day campaign that saw some of the most desperate fighting of the Pacific War. For the American forces, it was a brutal step toward the Japanese home islands. For the Japanese, both military and civilian, it was a point of no return. Propaganda issued directly from Tokyo had been unequivocal. Surrender was a disgrace, a betrayal of the emperor, and a fate far worse than death. It was this ideology, this ironclad belief system, that fueled the mass suicides that followed the American victory. Men, women, and children leaped from the cliffs of Marpy Point, choosing the jagged rocks and churning sea over capture. Their stories, often repeated in hushed, reverent tones, were meant to be a final, defiant act of patriotism. But for a select few, the choice was not so simple. Among the captured were several hundred women, a mix of military nurses, communications specialists, and other auxiliary personnel. They were young, mostly in their late teens and early 20s, and their indoctrination was as complete as any soldier's. They had been taught to believe that American soldiers were little more than unthinking brutes. The propaganda newsreels they had seen in Tokyo and on the front lines painted a terrifying picture: GIs as monstrous sadists who would desecrate their bodies and their honor. Their fear was visceral, a cold knot in their stomachs as they were herded into makeshift enclosures. Each woman braced herself for the inevitable, a silent prayer on her lips for a swift end. They watched their captors with wide, terrified eyes, scanning for the first sign of the cruelty they had been promised. What they saw instead was a disorienting spectacle. The American soldiers, though weary and battle-worn, did not look like the monsters of their nightmares. They moved with a detached efficiency, setting up tents, distributing water, and most surprisingly, offering food. The first meal was a shock. It wasn't the watery gruel they expected, but something substantial. Sea rations, though strange and foreign, were solid, nourishing. For women who had been subsisting on meager rations of rice and canned fish for months, this was a revelation. It was a stark, bewildering contrast to the brutal reality they had just escaped. The camp was orderly. Latrines were dug, medical tents were established, and a sense of routine began to emerge from the chaos. This was not the chaotic, hellish dungeon they had been promised. This was a place of relative calm. The American commanders, seasoned by the brutal realities of war, were well aware of the Japanese fear and the suicide epidemic. They had witnessed the horrific scenes at Marpy Point and understood that a different approach was needed. The 14th Marine Regiment, the unit tasked with managing the growing number of prisoners and civilians, was given strict orders: treat all captives with respect and dignity. This wasn't just a matter of Geneva Convention adherence. It was a pragmatic choice. They needed to show the Japanese that they were not the savages their leaders had claimed. The ultimate goal was to convince them, through humane treatment, to cooperate and, most importantly, to broadcast messages back to their comrades still in the caves, urging them to surrender. One of the most powerful tools in this psychological warfare was a young Japanese-American woman named Sergeant Nancy Ikemoto. Fluent in both English and Japanese, Ikemoto was a Nisei, a second-generation Japanese-American, and her presence was invaluable. She served as a bridge, a human link between two worlds at war. For the Japanese women, seeing a face that looked like their own, but wearing a U.S. Army uniform, was another profound shock. Ikemoto spoke to them in their own language, her voice soft and reassuring, explaining the rules of the camp, answering their questions, and, most importantly, listening to their fears. She was a living, breathing refutation of the propaganda. She wasn't a monster. She was a woman, an American, who treated them with respect. The psychological shift was gradual but inexorable. The women began to relax, to talk among themselves, and to share their bewilderment. They spoke of the clean water, the regular meals, the lack of violence. They noticed that the American soldiers did not stare at them with lustful eyes, did not taunt them, and did not abuse them. The promised horrors simply never materialized. The camp became a strange sort of sanctuary. They were safe from the incessant shelling, the constant threat of enemy fire, and the gnawing hunger that had defined their existence for months. It was a place where their basic needs were met, and their physical safety was assured. For these women who had been living on the razor's edge of survival, this was more than just a place of captivity. It was an oasis. As the days turned into weeks, a routine took hold. The women were given tasks to help with the camp's operations, washing clothes, preparing food, and caring for the sick and wounded. The work was simple but gave them a sense of purpose. They were no longer just passive victims. They were active participants in their own survival. The American doctors and nurses were a particular source of wonder. They treated the Japanese women with the same medical care they gave to their own soldiers. The wounds were cleaned, the infections were treated, and the sick were given medicine. This was a level of care they had not expected, a level of compassion that was almost impossible to reconcile with the enemy they had been taught to hate. It was in these small, daily acts of kindness that the narrative they had been given began to unravel. The simple provision of food, the assurance of safety, the basic dignity of medical care, these were acts that spoke louder than any propaganda broadcast. They began to question everything they had been told about the war, about the Americans, and about their own mission. The stark contrast between their pre-surrender lives and their current reality was a chasm of disbelief. One of the captured nurses, a young woman named Hiroko, found herself particularly transformed by the experience. She had seen firsthand the horrors of war, the suffering of both Japanese soldiers and civilians. She had seen her comrades choose suicide over surrender, and for a long time she believed they had made the right choice. But in the American camp she found herself not only alive but thriving. The food was good, she was no longer plagued by parasites, and for the first time in months she felt safe. The American doctor who treated a stubborn infection on her leg spoke to her with a quiet professionalism that was both foreign and comforting. He was simply a healer, not a soldier. And for Hiroko, that was a world-changing revelation. She and the other women began to realize that the enemy they had been fighting was not a faceless monster, but a collection of individuals, some of whom were capable of profound empathy. They had been told their choice to surrender was a disgrace, but in this new reality, it was their salvation. This realization, so simple and yet so revolutionary, would lead to a far more dangerous and unprecedented act of cooperation, one that would put their own lives at risk for the sake of their countrymen. But it was a risk they were now willing to take. The psychological transformation of the female Japanese POWs on Saipan was not just a personal journey of discovery, it was a military opportunity of immense strategic value. The American command understood that these women, once terrified and indoctrinated, were now a powerful weapon in the ongoing campaign. Their testimony, broadcast directly to their countrymen still hiding in the caves and jungles, could save countless lives and hasten the end of the fighting. The plan was simple in its conception, but fraught with peril. It required the cooperation of the very people who had been taught to despise them. The women, having found a semblance of safety and compassion in the American camp, were now asked to step into the role of propagandists, to betray the very ideology they had once held sacred. The idea was first proposed to a small group of the most cooperative women, including Hiroko. They were brought into a meeting with Sergeant Ikemoto and several high-ranking American officers. The proposal was laid out frankly. The Americans wanted them to speak on the radio. Their message would be simple. They were alive, safe, and being treated well. They would talk about the food, the medical care, and the lack of abuse. They would urge their countrymen to lay down their arms and surrender, to choose life over a pointless, suicidal death. The room was silent as the women absorbed the request. On the one hand, they had proof of the Americans' good intentions. On the other, they were being asked to commit the ultimate act of betrayal against their nation and their emperor. The very thought was anathema, a violation of everything they had been taught since childhood. The women exchanged nervous glances. The fear they had felt upon capture, now replaced by a different kind of dread. Hiroko was the first to speak. Her voice, though soft, was firm. She expressed her gratitude for the treatment they had received, but she also voiced their fears. "If we do this," she said, her eyes fixed on Ikemoto, "we will be considered traitors. If we are ever found by the Japanese army, we will be killed. Our families will be shamed." The American officers listened patiently, their expressions a mix of understanding and urgency. They knew the risks. They knew the deep-seated cultural and ideological barriers they were asking these women to cross. Sergeant Ikemoto stepped forward, her voice a calm counterpoint to their anxiety. She spoke of the hundreds of Japanese soldiers and civilians still hiding, starving, and terrified. She spoke of the futility of continued resistance and the immense loss of life. "You are not betraying your country," she explained. "You are saving your people. You are choosing life for them just as you chose it for yourselves." This framing, the idea of their actions as an act of salvation rather than betrayal, was the key. It resonated deeply with Hiroko and the others. They were nurses, after all, women who had dedicated their lives to saving others. This was simply a different, more profound way of doing the same thing. The women deliberated amongst themselves for hours, their voices a low murmur in the tropical night. They weighed the risk to their own lives and reputations against the potential to save the lives of their fellow countrymen. The memory of the mass suicides at Marpy Point, the faces of the terrified civilians they had seen, and the suffering of their wounded soldiers weighed heavily on their minds. Finally, they reached a consensus. They would do it. They would become the voice of a new reality, a direct challenge to the propaganda that had defined their lives. The radio broadcasts were a painstaking process. The women wrote their scripts, their words carefully chosen to convey a sense of authenticity and sincerity. They spoke not of grand political or military ideologies, but of simple human truths. They talked about the taste of clean water, the feeling of a full stomach, the relief of having their wounds treated. They spoke about the American soldiers who were not monsters, but men who shared their sea rations and treated them with respect. Their voices, often shaky with emotion, were broadcast from a mobile radio unit, their message echoing across the island, reaching into the deepest caves and most secluded jungle hideouts. The effect was immediate and, for the Americans, almost unbelievable. Small groups of Japanese soldiers and civilians began to emerge from the jungle. Their faces gaunt, their bodies emaciated, but their fear of capture now tempered by a sliver of hope. The first group to surrender was a small squad of soldiers who had been hiding for weeks. They were starving, sick, and demoralized. They had heard the broadcasts, and though they were initially skeptical, the voices of the women, so familiar and authentic, had finally broken through their indoctrination. They approached the American lines with their hands up, their weapons on the ground, a tentative faith in their eyes. They told the Americans that the broadcasts had convinced them. It was a victory not of force, but of humanity. The women's testimony was more effective than any bombing raid or artillery barrage. It was a direct appeal to their shared humanity, a simple message of survival that cut through the noise of propaganda. The radio broadcasts continued for weeks, their impact growing with each new surrender. The American military used the testimony of the new captives to make the broadcasts even more compelling. The messages became more specific, more detailed, tailored to the fears and doubts of those still in hiding. The women became unlikely heroes of a psychological war, their voices a siren song of hope in a sea of despair. But their mission was not without its risks. The Japanese forces still active on the island, though scattered and depleted, were aware of the broadcasts. They knew who was speaking and what they were saying. For the women, this meant that if the Japanese ever managed to break through American lines or launch a counterattack, they would be a primary target. They had crossed a line, and there was no going back. As the Saipan campaign drew to a close and the last pockets of resistance were mopped up, the psychological warfare continued on a different front. The women, along with the other captives, were to be moved to a more permanent POW camp, a place where they would be housed until the end of the war. This was not the end of their story, but the beginning of a new chapter, one that would take them to a place that would challenge their perceptions even further. They were no longer just prisoners. They were witnesses, symbols of a new kind of warfare, a war of hearts and minds. They had seen the enemy not as a monster, but as a human being, and they had shown their own people the same. But the ultimate test of their newfound reality was yet to come, and it was a journey that would take them far from the blood-soaked shores of Saipan to a place they could never have imagined, a place they would truly come to know as a sanctuary. The journey from Saipan to the American mainland was long and arduous, a passage across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean that marked a profound, final separation from their homeland. For the Japanese women, now a small but significant cohort of a much larger group of prisoners and civilian internees, the sea voyage was a time for reflection and fear. They had left behind the battlefields where their comrades had died, the cliffs where so many had ended their lives, and the jungle where they had lived in a state of constant terror. They were moving toward a place they knew only from the propaganda they had once believed: America, the heart of the enemy's power. Despite their positive experiences on Saipan, the old anxieties stirred. What would their lives be like in a permanent camp, far from the front lines? Would the kindness they had experienced be a temporary facade, a tactic of psychological warfare? Their destination was Camp Hearn, a prisoner of war camp located in the dusty plains of Texas. It was a place far removed from the tropical humidity and constant warfare of the Pacific. As their convoy of buses pulled into the camp, the women saw a sight that was both a shock and a source of immediate relief. The camp was not a collection of tents, but a series of permanent, well-constructed wooden barracks, arranged in neat rows. It was clean, orderly, and surrounded by a high fence, but the overall impression was one of structure and permanence, not a temporary prison. The Texas sun, hot and unforgiving, was a stark contrast to the humid climate they were used to. But the welcome they received was another revelation. The American guards and personnel at Camp Hearn were a different breed from the battle-hardened Marines of Saipan. They were primarily older men, some of them veterans of World War I, others deemed unfit for combat. They were the custodians of a large population of German and Japanese POWs. Their approach was one of detached professionalism, a focus on order and discipline rather than emotional or psychological warfare. But for the Japanese women, this was another kind of blessing. It meant they were treated as human beings, as individuals to be managed, not as symbols of a defeated enemy. The guards, in their matter-of-fact way, simply followed the rules of the Geneva Convention, which were, in their eyes, just standard operating procedure. The barracks were a particular source of wonder. They were Spartan but clean and well-maintained. Each woman was assigned a bunk and given a basic set of personal items, including a change of clothes, a towel, and soap. For women who had been living in filth and squalor for months, this was a luxury. The sanitary conditions were a marvel. They had access to clean latrines and showers with running water, a simple comfort that felt like an unimaginable extravagance. The food, though simple, was a consistent and nourishing source of sustenance. The American military ration provided them with more calories and a greater variety of nutrients than they had received in years. They were given a regular diet of meat, vegetables, and bread, a stark contrast to the rice and canned fish that had been their staple. Many of them began to gain weight, their emaciated frames filling out as their bodies recovered from the privations of war. The camp's administration, under the command of Colonel O.R. Jones, understood the importance of keeping the prisoners occupied and their morale high. To this end, They implemented a program of work and recreation that was designed to mimic, as much as possible, a normal life. The women were given a choice of tasks, from working in the camp's kitchen to laundry and sewing. The work was not punitive. It was a way of earning a small wage, a few cents a day that could be used to buy items from the camp store, like candy, cigarettes, or stationery to write letters. This small taste of economic freedom was a powerful motivator and a reminder of a world they had thought they had lost forever. Beyond the work, the camp offered a range of recreational activities. There was a library with books and magazines, though many were in English, a language few of the women understood. The American guards, in their own quiet way, tried to bridge the gap. They would bring in Japanese language books and newspapers from other camps or from Japanese-American communities. There was a softball field and a volleyball court, and though the women were initially shy and hesitant, they were encouraged to play. Sports became a way of socializing, of breaking down the barriers of language and culture. It was on the softball field, for example, that one of the young women, a nurse named Emmy, learned to laugh again, a sound that had been absent from her life for too long. For the Japanese women, the most profound psychological shift was the simple fact of their safety. They were no longer under the threat of shelling or aerial bombardment. They no longer had to worry about the constant hunger or the gnawing fear of disease. Their days were defined by a regular routine, a predictable rhythm of work, meals, and rest. This was a form of peace they had not known since before the war began. It was a peace not just of a lack of conflict, but of a complete absence of the constant, low-grade terror that had defined their lives for years. The camp, with its rules and regulations, its fences and its guards, was not a prison to them. It was a sanctuary, a place where they could begin to heal, both physically and emotionally. They began to compare their new lives to the ones they had left behind. They spoke of the brutal discipline of the Imperial Japanese Army, the constant indoctrination, the expectation of suicide over surrender. They remembered the starvation, the illness, and the psychological burden of a war they were destined to lose. And then they looked at their present reality. A full stomach, a clean bed, access to medical care, and the simple dignity of being treated as a human being. It was a comparison that was not just stark, but revolutionary. It was a revelation that had the power to change not just their own minds, but the minds of a generation. They had been taught that the Americans were the enemy, and they had found them, in the most unlikely of places, to be their saviors. But this newfound freedom, this sense of peace, was not without its own set of challenges, as they would soon discover that even in paradise, the psychological wounds of war could still fester, and their ultimate fate was still in the hands of the same enemy they had come to admire. The quiet, predictable rhythm of life at Camp Hearn was a balm to the shattered psyches of the Japanese women. But it also became a setting for a different kind of conflict, the internal struggle to reconcile their past with their present. For many, the transition was a source of profound cognitive dissonance. They were living a life of relative comfort and safety, a paradise, as some would later describe it, provided by the very people they had been taught to despise and fear. This created an emotional and philosophical chasm that was difficult to cross. On one side was the unwavering loyalty and sacrifice they had been indoctrinated with, the deeply ingrained belief in the divinity of the emperor and the glory of dying for one's country. On the other was the simple, undeniable reality of their current lives. They were alive, safe, and their captors were treating them with dignity. The women formed their own community within the camp, a small insular world where they could speak their own language and share their experiences. They spent hours discussing the war, the propaganda they had been fed, and the shocking kindness they had received. The most poignant conversations often revolved around their families and their future. They were a world away from home, and for all the creature comforts of the camp, they were still prisoners. They worried about their loved ones, about the bombs falling on Tokyo, and the fate of their country. But they also began to envision a future for themselves. A future that was no longer defined by the grim specter of a glorious, suicidal death. They talked about returning home not as traitors but as survivors, as witnesses to a different reality. The American authorities at Camp Hearn Particularly the medical staff recognized the psychological needs of their prisoners. They began to implement programs to address the trauma the women had endured. They encouraged journaling, art, and music as a way for the women to express their feelings and process their experiences. For a culture that often valued stoicism and emotional restraint, this was a difficult but ultimately therapeutic process. One young woman, a former communications specialist named Yoko, began to paint. Her canvases, initially filled with dark, abstract images of war and destruction, slowly began to transform. She painted scenes of the Texas landscape, the wide blue sky, the dusty earth, and the simple barracks. Her art became a visual diary of her healing, a testament to her journey from a place of darkness to a place of light. The interactions between the Japanese women and the American guards and staff were a source of constant fascination and, at times, humor. The language barrier was immense, but a form of pidgin English and Japanese, supplemented by gestures and facial expressions, soon emerged. The guards would teach the women a few words of English, and in return the women would teach them some basic Japanese phrases. These small, daily interactions built a foundation of trust and mutual respect that transcended the circumstances of their captivity. It was a powerful human connection in a world defined by conflict. The American staff also brought in outside groups, including local Japanese-American families, to visit the camp. For the Japanese women, this was another profound moment. To see other people who looked like them, who spoke their language, but who were also Americans, was a final, irrefutable challenge to their preconceived notions of the enemy. The news from the war front, filtered through the camp's radio and newspapers, was a constant reminder of the world they had left behind. They heard about the fall of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the firebombing of Tokyo, and the relentless advance of the American forces. The news was devastating, but it also reinforced their belief that their choice to surrender was the right one. They were safe, while their countrymen were still dying in a war that was already lost. This realization brought with it a different kind of pain, the sorrow of a lost cause and the grief for the millions who had died in vain. Their paradise was also a place of mourning. As the war entered its final stages, the psychological pressure on the prisoners intensified. They knew the end was coming, but they did not know what it would bring. Would they be sent home to a devastated, occupied nation? Would they be met with shame and ostracism? Or would they be able to use their unique experiences to help rebuild their country? The answers were a terrifying unknown. But for the time being, they had each other and the relative safety of the camp. Their world, once so vast and dangerous, had shrunk to the boundaries of Camp Hearn, and within those boundaries, they had found something unexpected and precious, a community, a sense of belonging, and the first glimmers of hope for a future they had thought they would never have. But their journey was not over. The true test of their resilience and their new perspective would come not in captivity, but in their eventual return to a broken and defeated homeland, where they would be forced to confront the very people who had once told them that their choice was a disgrace. The news of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, followed swiftly by the Emperor's broadcast of surrender, was a seismic shock that rippled through Camp Hearn. The initial reaction among the Japanese women was a profound, guttural cry of grief. The war they had lived and fought through, the war that had cost them so much, was over. But the victory they had been promised had not come. It was a crushing final defeat. Yet, amidst the sorrow, there was a quiet, undeniable sense of relief. The constant, gnawing fear of a violent, painful death was finally gone. They were alive. They had survived. Their decision to surrender, once an act of betrayal, was now revealed to be a choice of survival. For those who had worked on the radio broadcasts on Saipan, the end of the war was a vindication. They had chosen life for themselves and had urged others to do the same. The end of the war, however, presented a new set of challenges. The women were now in a strange state of limbo. They were no longer prisoners of war, but they were not yet free to go home. The American military, now an occupying force, had to make a decision about the fate of the thousands of Japanese POWs and civilians in its care. The process of repatriation was slow and complex. For the women, it was a time of mixed emotions. The paradise of Camp Hearn, A place that had been a sanctuary was now a source of impatience and anxiety. They were eager to return home, to see their families, to begin the process of rebuilding their lives. But they were also afraid. They knew that their experience of American kindness and their choice to surrender would not be understood by many of their countrymen. They would be seen as traitors, as collaborators with the enemy. The American authorities, recognizing this fear, took steps to prepare the women for their return. They provided them with new clothes and personal items. They gave them lectures on the new political and social landscape of Japan, a country now occupied by the very people they had been held captive by. They were told about the new constitution, the changes in the government, and the end of the emperor's divine status. This was another profound shock. The emperor, a figure of almost godlike reverence, was now just a man. The ideology they had lived and died for was gone, replaced by a new democratic order. For many, this was a difficult concept to grasp. It was a psychological and emotional upheaval that was in some ways more profound than the defeat itself. When the time for repatriation finally came, the women were put on ships and began their long journey back across the Pacific. The mood on the ships was a mix of quiet hope and deep-seated fear. They were going home, but they were going home to a country that was devastated, a country that had lost everything, including its national identity. As their ships pulled into the harbors of Japan, the sight was one of utter destruction. The cities were in ruins, the buildings were leveled, and the landscape was a charred, desolate wasteland. This was the result of the war they had escaped, the end they had chosen to avoid. They were met by American and Japanese officials who processed them and prepared them for their return to civilian life. The officials were often cold and professional, a sharp contrast to the familiar faces of the guards at Camp Hearn. The women were now in a no-man's land, no longer prisoners, not yet fully integrated into their new reality. They were seen with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity by their fellow Japanese citizens. The stories of their experience in the American camps, of the good food and the kindness, were met with disbelief and, in some cases, with anger. For a population that had suffered so much, the idea that their defeated enemies had been living in a kind of comfort was almost impossible to accept. The women, in turn, were often hesitant to speak of their experiences. They learned to be cautious, to choose their words carefully, to avoid saying anything that might lead to ostracism or worse. For Hiroko and the other women who had been on the radio, the fear of retribution was a constant companion. They knew that their actions, while a source of pride in the American camps, would be seen as a form of treason by many of their countrymen. They had to navigate a new social landscape, one where the old rules of honor and duty had been shattered, but where new, unwritten rules of silence and shame had taken their place. They were survivors, but they were also, in a way, exiles in their own country. The paradise they had lived in had not just saved their lives, it had also made them different. A different they now had to hide. But their experiences would not remain hidden forever. As the years went by and Japan began to rebuild, the stories of the Japanese women who had been prisoners in America would begin to slowly emerge, revealing a truth that was far more complex and human than any of the propaganda had ever allowed. Their story would become a quiet, powerful testament to the triumph of humanity over ideology, a testament that would, decades later, finally find its voice. In the decades that followed the war, the women who had been prisoners at Camp Hearn carried their experiences with them like a secret. Japan was in a period of intense transformation, a society grappling with the profound changes brought by defeat and occupation. The old values of military honor and self-sacrifice were being replaced by new ones of democracy, economic growth, and pacifism. For the former prisoners, this new reality was a strange and often disorienting one. The country they had returned to was not the one they had left. The old social structures and cultural norms were in flux, and their unique stories of survival and unexpected kindness did not always fit neatly into the new national narrative. Many chose to keep their past to themselves, to blend in and rebuild their lives without drawing attention to their wartime experiences. The paradise they had known was a private memory, a quiet truth that was too complex to share with a society that was still processing its collective trauma. Hiroko, The former nurse, who had been so instrumental in the radio broadcasts on Saipan, found a job in a small clinic in Tokyo. She worked hard, married, and had a family. She never spoke of her time in the American camps. The memory of the clean barracks, the nourishing food, and the compassionate care was a cherished but silent part of her life. She saw the American GIs who now patrolled the streets of Tokyo and felt no animosity. She saw them as individuals, not as an enemy. Her experiences had given her a perspective that few of her countrymen shared, a perspective she knew she could not fully articulate. The truth was that the war, for her, had not ended with defeat, but with a profound, personal victory of survival and discovery. As the years turned into decades and Japan's economy boomed, the country began to look back at its wartime history with a more critical and open eye. Historians, sociologists, and journalists began to unearth the stories of the forgotten, the people who had not fit into the official narratives of glorious sacrifice or heroic resistance. It was during this period that the stories of the female Japanese POWs began to emerge. The silence that had defined their lives for so long was slowly, tentatively, being broken. Researchers from Japan and America, poring over old military records and conducting interviews, began to piece together the remarkable story of Camp Hearn and the women who had been held there. When the first articles and books were published, the reaction in Japan was one of astonishment and, for many, of relief. The story of the Paradise Camps was a radical refutation of the propaganda that had defined the war. It was a human story, a story of an enemy that was not a monster, of a defeat that was not a disgrace, and of a surrender that was not a betrayal, but a choice for life. For the surviving women, now elderly and with grandchildren, the public recognition was a source of great pride and a final form of healing. They were no longer the silent semi-exiles of a defeated nation. They were heroes of a different kind, survivors whose story held a powerful lesson for a new generation. Their story became a point of academic and public interest. The women were invited to speak at universities and historical societies. They told their stories of the Texas sun, the simple kindness of the guards, the taste of American sea rations, and the profound, transformative power of being treated as a human being. They spoke not of the horrors of war, but of the unexpected kindness that had saved their lives. Their testimony was a powerful emotional corrective to the national memory of the war, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the light of human decency can shine through. The stories of the female Japanese POWs at Camp Hearn are a unique and powerful chapter in the history of the Second World War. They are a testament to the fact that the human spirit, when stripped of the ideological armor of patriotism and hate, is capable of finding connection and compassion in the most unlikely of places. They remind us that the enemies we are taught to despise are often just people, caught in a conflict that is larger than themselves. Their paradise was not a place of luxury or opulence. It was a place of safety, of dignity, and of simple human kindness. It was a place that allowed them to heal, to find a new path, and to decades later share a truth that has the power to change how we see not just the past, but the very nature of conflict itself. Their silence, so long a source of protection, had finally been broken, and the truth of their experience had found its voice. A voice that continues to echo through history, reminding us that even in war, the human capacity for empathy can triumph over the most powerful forms of indoctrination, and the greatest act of courage is often simply to choose to live.